A decorated soldier, once loyal to the system that shaped him, is thrust into a deadly conspiracy when his former mentor, long thought dead, resurfaces as the leader of a rogue mercenary force. What begins as a simple mission to uncover the truth spirals into a battle far greater than he ever anticipated. Betrayed by his own government and framed as a traitor, he is left with no choice but to go underground, navigating a world where alliances are fleeting and trust is a rare commodity. With his wife taken hostage and his closest allies hunted, he must infiltrate the very organization he seeks to destroy. As he burrows deeper, he discovers that the mercenaries are merely pawns in a larger game, one orchestrated by faceless power brokers who manipulate global events from behind closed doors. These men don't operate in shadows. They exist in broad daylight, wearing suits instead of uniforms, wielding influence instead of weapons. Forced to play along, he walks a razor's edge, pretending to serve those who see him as nothing more than another expendable asset. But when his mission demands that he betray the only people who have ever stood by him, the weight of his choices becomes unbearable. With time running out, he devises a plan to turn the tables, to rip apart the network from the inside before they erase him for good. As he sets his final trap, he realizes the war he's fighting doesn't end with one mission, one name, or even one victory. There will always be another ghost willing to take the place of those he's taken down. And as the walls close in, he faces the ultimate question. Can a single man truly dismantle a system that was built to survive without him? Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The funeral was meant to be a tribute, a final farewell to a man who had served his country with honor. It was supposed to be a moment of solemnity, of remembrance. But beneath the polished ceremony, the whispered condolences and the measured grief, something darker simmered just out of sight. Sergeant Peter Caldwell stood among the uniformed soldiers, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He clutched the folded flag to his chest, feeling the weight of it. More than fabric, it was a symbol of a legacy, a lifetime of sacrifice. The name etched into the polished headstone in front of him did not belong to just any soldier. It belonged to Morgan Steele, a war hero, a leader, a man who had shaped Peter's career, his ideals, his very sense of duty. The rifle salute cracked through the air, a final gesture of respect, yet the sound felt hollow to Peter. He had seen too much, lost too many. The weight of his mentor's death pressed against him, but something in his gut refused to settle. Something wasn't right. Morgan Steele wasn't supposed to die like this. Peter's gaze swept over the gathering, noting every detail the way years of training had conditioned him to. The military officials, their faces a blend of grief and obligation. The civilians, some genuine in their sorrow, others merely present because of what Morgan had represented. Steele had been larger than life, a warrior and strategist. Men like him didn't just die in quiet hospital rooms, surrounded by white walls and fading breath. A hand brushed his shoulder. "Pete," a familiar voice murmured. He turned to see Alex Carter, an old friend from his unit. The lines on Alex's face had deepened since they last fought together, but his sharp eyes remained the same. "You holding up?" Alex asked. Peter nodded, but the unease remained. "Something doesn't sit right," Peter admitted. Alex exhaled, shaking his head. "I know what you mean. Feels off." Peter didn't get a chance to respond. His phone buzzed against his hip. A sharp vibration. A break in the air, cutting through the funeral's muted sorrow. Instinctively, he pulled the device from his pocket. An unknown number. Frowning, he stepped away from the mourners, putting distance between himself and the polished casket draped in the flag. He answered. "Caldwell," he said, his voice low, controlled. A pause, then a voice, distorted, mechanical, unreadable. "You're running out of time, Sergeant." Peter's muscles tensed. The words slithered through the speaker. Cold and deliberate. "Who is this?" he demanded. The reply was a chuckle, low and unsettling. "If you want to see Emily again, you'll do exactly as we say." His heart stopped. The grip on his phone tightened. Emily, his wife, his anchor, the only part of his life that had remained untouched by war. "Where is she?" Peter's voice turned razor-sharp, his pulse a steady drumbeat of control and fury. "She's alive, for now." The world around him dimmed. The funeral, the somber faces, the crisp uniforms, all of it faded into the background. There was only this voice, this threat. The weight in his chest shifted, morphing into something else. Not grief, not sorrow. War. "What do you want?" he ground out. The voice on the other end remained calm, methodical. "You leave the military. Today." Peter's breath came slow and controlled, but his mind was racing. Leave the military? It wasn't just a demand, it was a severance, a shackle around his future. His entire life had been built on service, on duty. Walking away wasn't an option. "You're making a mistake," Peter said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. A chuckle. "No, Sergeant. You are." The call ended. Peter stood motionless, phone still pressed to his ear, the echo of the final words ringing louder than the gun salute behind him. Then instinct kicked in. He turned, scanning the funeral grounds with the precision of a soldier trained to detect threats. Someone was watching him. Someone had orchestrated this. Emily was in danger, and the only way to save her was to walk away from everything. The folded flag in his arms suddenly felt meaningless, because at that moment, Peter realized this war wasn't over. It had just begun. The words, "You leave the military, today," echoed in Peter's mind like an explosion that never quite faded. He stood at the edge of the funeral, the weight of the folded flag still in his grip, but his world had already shifted into a different battlefield. Emily was gone, kidnapped, and the only way to save her was to abandon the life he had built. His first instinct was action, move, assess, track, eliminate. Years of training coursed through his veins, turning fear into sharp-edged strategy, but he forced himself to take a steadying breath, to resist the immediate need to lash out. Think. The phone in his hand was still warm from the call. He checked the number. Unknown. Of course. Who the hell were they? And how had they gotten to Emily? He turned sharply, scanning the cemetery again. Someone here was watching him. Someone was waiting for his reaction. He forced himself to walk back toward the funeral, his boots crunching over the cold, damp earth. His movements were controlled, his expression unreadable. Alex Carter caught his gaze immediately. "You okay?" Peter didn't answer. He couldn't, not yet. His mind raced through the possibilities. He needed information. He needed leverage. And most of all, he needed time. He clenched his jaw. They wouldn't give him time. As if on cue, the distant roar of engines filled the air. Not the clean, disciplined hum of military vehicles. No, this was different. Motorcycles. Peter's entire body went rigid. The sound grew louder, closer, the vibrations rumbling through the ground like approaching thunder. His hands curled into fists. He turned just as the first bikes came into view beyond the cemetery gates. 4 of them, then 6. By the time they all pulled up, at least a dozen riders had surrounded the exit. Their presence was a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the funeral, a mockery of the moment. Alex tensed beside him. "Tell me you see this too." Peter barely nodded, his eyes locked onto the lead rider, a massive man with a scar running down the side of his face, partially hidden beneath a dark helmet. He didn't move to remove it, didn't step off his bike. He just waited. A challenge. The rest of the funeral crowd hadn't noticed yet. They were still wrapped in their grief, murmuring condolences, wiping away tears. But Peter knew this moment wasn't about grief anymore. This was a declaration. Alex exhaled sharply. "That's not normal." "No," Peter muttered, jaw tightening. "It's not." For a moment no one moved. Then, as if bored with the silence, the lead biker tilted his head and raised a hand. He gave a slow, deliberate wave, mocking, taunting, and then the group revved their engines as one. Peter's muscles coiled. He knew what this was. A warning. They weren't here to attack. Not yet. They were here to remind him, "We own this now." Alex muttered a curse under his breath. "What the hell do they want?" Peter didn't answer. He was already moving, heading straight for the motorcycles. As soon as he took a step forward, the lead biker raised one finger. A simple command. The entire group backed up, their engines snarling like a pack of wolves pulling away, just enough to stay out of reach. Then, without another word, they peeled out one by one until the cemetery was silent again. But they had left their mark. Peter's hands flexed at his sides. They had made their point. Alex stepped up beside him. "That wasn't random." "No," Peter agreed, his voice low, his heart pounded. "That was for me." Alex studied him for a long moment. "What the hell is going on, Pete?" Peter hesitated. He trusted Alex. They had fought together, bled together. But if these people had Emily, if they were willing to pull a stunt like this at a funeral, he had to be careful. "I don't know yet," Peter lied. Alex exhaled sharply, watching him closely. "I don't buy that for a second." Peter didn't have time to argue. He was already moving, already forming a plan. He needed to get out of here, now. Whoever had Emily was watching. Whoever had Emily had power. And Peter had just run out of time. The drive home felt different. Every car on the road seemed like a potential threat. Every intersection felt like a trap. His instincts screamed at him to take side streets, to change routes, to go somewhere, anywhere but home. But he needed to see it for himself. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the house was too quiet. The curtains in the front window were slightly drawn, not how Emily left them. Peter's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He forced himself to breathe, to push down the gut-wrenching fear threatening to rip him apart. He stepped out of the car, his movements controlled, measured. The front door was locked, normal, but the air felt wrong. He unlocked it, stepped inside. The house was immaculate. Emily's keys were on the counter. Her favorite mug was in the sink. The TV remote was where she always left it. But she was gone. Peter moved through the rooms like a soldier clearing a battlefield. He checked everything. No signs of struggle. No forced entry, no blood. His chest tightened. They had taken her clean. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his stomach twisting. Another unknown number. He answered. Silence. Then the same voice from before. Calm, methodical. "Are you home, Sergeant?" Peter's grip on the phone turned white-knuckled tight. "Where is she?" A soft chuckle. "Safe. For now." His vision blurred with rage. "You listen to me, you son of a—" A click. The line went dead. Peter threw the phone across the room. It smashed into the wall, pieces flying, but the rage inside him didn't fade. He stood there, his breathing heavy, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, slowly, he turned back toward the kitchen table. A single envelope sat there. He hadn't noticed it when he walked in. But now it was all he could see. He reached for it, his hands steady even as his world crumbled around him. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one sentence. "Leave the military, or she dies." Peter stared at the words, his heart a hammer against his ribs. This was it, the choice he couldn't escape, his duty, his honor, his entire life. Or Emily, his wife, his everything. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Peter sat in his kitchen, staring at the paper, his mind a battlefield of rage, desperation, and strategy. The words on the page were clear, absolute. Leave the military, or she dies. There was no room for negotiation, no second option. It was a demand, and one that came from someone who knew exactly how to make him obey. But Peter Caldwell was not a man who bowed easily. His fingers traced the edges of the note, his breath slow, controlled. Every fiber of his being screamed for action, to track down whoever had done this, to tear them apart. But this wasn't a firefight. This was psychological warfare. They had played their first move. Now he had to decide how to counter. His first instinct was to call someone, his commanding officer, military intelligence, anyone who could help. But the presence of those bikers at the funeral had been a message. They were watching. Every step he took, every call he made would be known. He couldn't afford mistakes. His hands moved before his mind caught up. He pulled open a drawer, grabbing an old burner phone he kept for emergencies. He powered it on, watching the small screen flicker to life. He needed information. Who was behind this? Why had they taken Emily? Was this about him, or was he just a pawn in something bigger? He typed out a single message to Alex. Need to meet. Urgent. No calls. Same spot. Alex would understand. They had a place, a run-down service station on the outskirts of town, a relic from another time. It was where they met when things needed to be said off the books. No cameras, no listening ears, just asphalt, dust, and the ghosts of a forgotten America. Peter grabbed his jacket and gun, slipping the weapon into the holster at his waist. He didn't care if they were watching. Let them see him moving. Let them wonder what he was going to do next. The ride to the service station was uneventful. But Peter's mind never stopped turning. He drove past the speed limit, barely seeing the road, his thoughts consumed by possibilities. Morgan Steele's death, the bikers at the funeral, The voice on the phone. Emily, gone. There had to be a connection. Alex was already there when he arrived, leaning against his truck, arms crossed. He didn't speak, just watched as Peter stepped out of his car and approached. Peter didn't waste time. I need to know everything you can find on the group that showed up at the funeral. Alex studied him for a long moment. This about what happened back home? Peter tensed. I don't know yet. Alex sighed, rubbing a hand through his short, cropped hair. Look, man, I ran some checks after they rolled in. They're not just some random club. They call themselves the Reapers. They're ex-military, not the kind who shake hands and do charity runs. The kind who went off the grid, stayed in the shadows. Mercs, Black Ops gone rogue. Steele worked with some of them before. Off-record shit, the kind we were never supposed to know about. Peter's stomach turned. And you're just telling me this now? I didn't think it mattered, Alex said. Not until I saw your face back at the funeral. Not until I saw them watching you. Peter exhaled slowly. He wanted to punch something, to channel his frustration into action, but he couldn't afford emotion. Not now. They took Emily. Alex's posture shifted instantly. What? Peter clenched his fists. I got a call. No names, no demands beyond one. I leave the military. That's the price for her life. Alex cursed under his breath. You think it steals people? Peter nodded slowly. If Morgan was in bed with them, faking his death makes sense. But why come after me? Why now? Alex's expression darkened. Because Steele knew you'd never join them. But he also knew what you'd do to save your wife. Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Peter ran a hand down his face. I need to find her, Alex. I don't have time for games. Alex hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notepad. I heard something from a guy I used to run with. The Reapers have been meeting up at an old airstrip outside of town. No one goes there unless they have serious business. Peter's eyes sharpened. That's where I start. Alex shook his head. You can't just roll in there, Pete. You'll be dead before you step onto the tarmac. Peter looked at him, his voice a quiet storm. I'm not going to wait for them to send me another message. I need to get ahead of them. Alex sighed. All right, I'll go with you. But if we're doing this, we do it right. Peter nodded. He wasn't used to asking for help, but this wasn't just about him. This was about Emily. They drove separately, keeping distance between them in case things went south. As they neared the airstrip, Peter pulled his car onto a dirt path, cutting the headlights. Alex followed suit. The airstrip was nothing but cracked pavement and rusted-out hangars. A relic of the past, forgotten by the world. But not forgotten by them. A row of motorcycles was lined up near a warehouse, men moving in and out, armed, focused. This wasn't a casual meetup. This was something bigger. Peter and Alex stayed low, creeping through the darkness, using the cover of old vehicles to get closer. Peter pulled out a small pair of binoculars, scanning the area. His blood turned ice when he saw him, Morgan Steele, alive, standing at the center of the group, talking to the lead biker from the funeral. Alex muttered a curse. Son of a bitch. Peter's grip on the binoculars tightened. Steele wasn't just alive, he was leading them, and then, as if sensing the weight of Peter's stare, Steele turned. Even from this distance, Peter could see it. Steele knew he was there. A slow smile curved on the older man's face. Peter's stomach dropped as Steele casually raised a radio to his lips. A second later, headlights burst to life all around them. Engines roared. They were already surrounded. A voice crackled through the night, amplified by a loudspeaker. Nice try, Sergeant, Steele's voice came through, but you should have stayed in the dark. Peter and Alex had no time to run, no time to hide. The hunt had begun. Engines roared like a pack of wolves circling their prey, their headlights slashing through the night and pinning Peter and Alex in place. The sudden flood of light burned through the darkness, stealing away any hope of disappearing back into the shadows. Peter's instincts screamed at him to move, to fight, to act, but his mind was already calculating the angles. The options. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, closing in from all sides. Their movements weren't sloppy. These weren't your average gang enforcers. They were precise, controlled. Former soldiers turned mercenaries, just as Alex had warned, and leading them, standing casually by the warehouse with a damn near smug expression, was Morgan Steele, alive, not dead, not buried, not honored with the folded flag Peter had clutched in his hands just hours before. Everything about the funeral, the ceremony, the grief, it had been a lie. Peter's grip tightened on his sidearm, but he knew firing now would mean instant death. They weren't going to let him win a shootout. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker, carrying Steele's smooth, measured tone. "Put your weapons down, gentlemen. We both know you're outnumbered." Alex barely shifted, keeping his voice low. "You got a plan?" "Yeah," Peter murmured. "Try not to get shot." A few of the bikers chuckled as if they could hear them. Maybe they could. Peter exhaled through his nose and slowly, deliberately, lowered his weapon. He set it on the ground without breaking eye contact with Steele. Alex hesitated, then followed suit. Satisfied, Steele raised a hand. "Bring them in." The men moved fast, two of them grabbing Peter by the arms, another yanking Alex forward with unnecessary force. Neither of them fought back. Not yet. They were dragged across the cracked pavement, past the row of idling motorcycles, and toward the looming warehouse. Up close, Peter could see the details. The subtle military organization hidden beneath the rough biker exterior. The way they moved, the way their weapons were positioned. They weren't just playing soldier, they had been soldiers. As they were shoved forward, Steele finally stepped out of the shadows, closing the distance between them. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice carrying the same commanding weight it always had. He looked older than Peter remembered, but not by much. His eyes were sharp, assessing, and filled with something Peter couldn't quite place. Beneath the smugness, there was something else. A test. A challenge. Peter met his gaze. "Had to see it for myself." Steele smirked. "And?" Peter's jaw tightened. "You should have stayed dead." Steele chuckled, shaking his head. "Always so rigid, always so bound to the system. That's what made you good, Peter, but it also made you predictable." Peter didn't bite. He knew how Steele operated. He wanted a reaction, a slip. Instead, Peter scanned the area. The men, the exits, the layout. He'd done raids on warehouses like this before. He knew how these places worked. Steele noticed. His smirk deepened. "Looking for a way out? There isn't one." Peter said nothing. Steele sighed, pacing in front of them. "You're probably wondering why I did it, why I faked my death. Why I'm here." Peter cut in, his voice flat. "I don't give a damn why you're here. I want my wife back." Steele stopped, watching him carefully. "I know." Something flickered in his gaze, but Peter didn't trust it. He didn't trust anything anymore. Steele took a slow breath. "But that's not how this works." Peter clenched his fists. "Then how does it work?" Steele nodded toward one of the bikers. The man disappeared into the warehouse, then returned a moment later. He wasn't alone. Emily. Peter's chest went tight. She was alive. Her hands were bound, her mouth gagged. But her eyes, locked onto his with an intensity that burned through the chaos. She wasn't broken. She wasn't pleading. She was fighting. He took a step forward, the barrel of a rifle pressed into his ribs. Steele lifted a finger, wagging it like a disappointed teacher. "Careful, Peter. You don't set the terms here." Peter forced himself to breathe, to pull back the violent rage threatening to take over. This wasn't about immediate action. This was about strategy. Emily wasn't hurt, at least not visibly. That meant they needed her alive, which meant he still had time. Steele watched the war play out in Peter's expression, then motioned for the man holding Emily to take her back inside. Peter caught the briefest glimpse of her shaking her head before the door shut behind her. Steele turned back. "You want her back? Then you do exactly what I tell you." Peter's teeth clenched. "You already have my answer." Steele's smirk never wavered. "I don't think so." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so that only Peter could hear. "You see, this isn't just about you. This isn't about your career. This is about who you are, and I know exactly who that is." Peter forced himself to stay silent. Steele smiled. "You're a soldier. You believe in duty, in honor. But what happens when the people you serve don't deserve it? What happens when the system you're protecting is the real enemy?" Peter didn't blink. "Save the speech." Steele chuckled. "Fine, let me put it another way." His expression darkened, losing the playful edge. "Leave the military. Walk away from everything. Join us." Peter stiffened. Steele tilted his head. "Or you'll never see Emily again." Peter's mind raced. He had prepared himself for this moment, for threats, for violence, but this... Steele wasn't just asking him to surrender, he was asking him to become something else. Steele took another step back. "You don't have to decide now. Sleep on it. But don't take too long. Because if I don't get the answer I want..." He gestured vaguely toward the warehouse doors. "Emily..." Peter's breathing slowed. His thoughts sharpened. He wasn't walking away, not from the military, not from who he was, and sure as hell not from Emily. But Steele didn't know that. Not yet. Peter exhaled, his expression unreadable. Fine, I'll think about it. Steele studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good, that's all I ask. With a wave of his hand, the bikers stepped back, clearing a path toward the cars. Take them back to town, Steele said. Let them stew on it. The men shoved Peter and Alex forward, but Peter didn't resist. Not yet, because this wasn't over. This was just the first move, and Peter Caldwell didn't lose. The ride back to town was long, the engines of the motorcycles droning like a storm cloud that wouldn't break. Peter sat in the passenger seat of Alex's truck, staring at the road ahead, his mind working through every possible angle, every possible mistake. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, but inside everything burned. Emily was alive. He had seen her, had looked into her eyes. She was fighting, but she wouldn't last forever. Steele and his men weren't stupid. They wouldn't keep her alive out of kindness. She was leverage, and leverage didn't last once it lost its usefulness. Alex's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His jaw was set, and Peter knew he was barely holding back his frustration. "You want to tell me what the hell that was?" Alex finally said, his voice low, sharp. Peter didn't answer right away. His mind was still in the warehouse, still standing in front of Steele, hearing that voice, feeling the weight of the impossible choice being shoved into his chest like a dull knife. "I'm not leaving the military," Peter finally said, his voice even, absolute. "Yeah, no shit," Alex snapped. "But what the hell is going on, Pete? Steele's alive, running some kind of mercenary biker army, and now he's holding Emily hostage? What the hell did we step into?" Peter closed his eyes for a brief second, forcing his breath to stay steady. "He wants me to join them. That's why they took Emily." Alex let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "That's insane." "Is it?" Peter murmured. Alex shot him a look. "Come on, man. You're one of the best operators the military has. You've got training most people wouldn't even believe exists. You think guys like Steele don't want that kind of talent on their side? They know you'd never agree to it willingly. So they take the one thing that matters most to you and put a gun to its head." Peter stared ahead. "Yeah, that's exactly what they did." The truck rolled into town, the quiet streets a stark contrast to the world they had just stepped out of. Peter's house loomed ahead, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It was just another structure, another weak point in a war he hadn't planned on fighting. Alex parked but didn't kill the engine. "You got a plan?" Peter exhaled. "First, I need to know everything. Who they are, what they're planning. Steele's not just some rogue soldier running a biker gang. This is something bigger." Alex drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. "You want to infiltrate?" Peter nodded once. "I need intel. I need to know where Emily is, how many men they have, what they're armed with, and I need someone who knows how Steele operates." Alex let out a slow breath. "I might know a guy, but it's a long shot." Peter turned to him. "I don't have the luxury of long shots. Alex, I need something now." Alex's jaw clenched. "There's an ex-merc who used to run with Steele, calls himself Boone. Word is he burned some bridges with Steele's people and barely made it out alive. If anyone's willing to talk, it's him. Where is he?" Alex gave a small smirk. "The kind of place a guy like him ends up when he's got nowhere left to go. Underground fight clubs. Cash fights, places where rules don't exist." Peter sighed. "Perfect." The club was buried in the back alleys of a part of town people pretended didn't exist. A steel door, a single overhead bulb buzzing like an angry hornet, and a man built like a tank standing guard outside. Alex walked up first, flashing a few folded bills. "We're looking for Boone." The guard barely blinked before nodding toward the door. "Downstairs, third fight." Peter followed Alex into the dark hallway, the muffled sounds of fists hitting flesh, and men shouting growing louder with each step. The basement was humid, the air thick with sweat and bloodlust. A makeshift cage stood at the center, and inside it, two men were beating each other senseless while a crowd roared around them. Peter barely paid attention to the fight. He was already scanning the room, picking out faces, threats, exits. And then he saw him. Boone. The man was sitting alone, a beer in one hand, his other arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. His face was bruised, a fresh cut across his brow. He looked exactly like someone who had seen too much and cared too little. Peter and Alex approached, and Boone barely glanced up. Not interested. Peter pulled out a chair and sat down. I think you are. Boone let out a low chuckle. Yeah? And who the hell are you? Peter leaned forward. The guy who needs to know how to bring Morgan Steele down. Boone's smirk faded. His beer stopped midair. Yeah, Peter said quietly. I know who you used to run with. Boone's jaw tensed. He put the beer down slowly. That's a dangerous thing to go poking around in. Friend. I don't have time to be careful, Peter said. They took my wife. Boone exhaled through his nose. Yeah. That sounds like them. Peter studied him. You left. Why? Boone's eyes darkened. Because Steele doesn't lead men. He controls them. You're either useful to him or you're a liability. There's no in-between. Why is he doing this? Boone hesitated, then leaned in. Steele didn't fake his death just to disappear, man. He's building something big. And the military? They know it. They just can't stop it. Peter's fists clenched under the table. Tell me everything. Boone glanced around, lowering his voice. You ever hear of Ghost Protocol? Peter's blood went cold. Ghost Protocol wasn't a myth. It was a classified initiative designed for one thing, to eliminate threats before they became threats. Boone nodded at Peter's reaction. Yeah, Steele was part of it. He saw what the military really did in the shadows, and he decided he could do it better. Peter inhaled slowly. So that's what this is. Boone nodded. He's not just running a gang, man. He's running a damn army. Rogue spec ops, mercs, soldiers the government pretends don't exist. He's taking contracts that no one else will touch. Black market weapons, assassinations, entire regime changes. The military's too slow, too controlled. Steele, he's efficient. Peter stared at him. And he wants me to be part of it. Boone smirked grimly. Yeah? Because he knows you're the only one good enough to stop him. Peter exhaled, the pieces falling into place. Steele wasn't just a rogue operator. He was a ghost leading other ghosts, and Peter had just stepped into a war he wasn't ready for. Boone took a swig of beer. If you're serious about taking him down, you're gonna need more than just guts, man. You're gonna need an army. Peter met his gaze, steel in his voice. Then let's build one. Boone's words echoed in Peter's mind long after they left the underground fight club. Steele wasn't just leading a rogue faction of ex-soldiers. He was building an army, an operation so deep in the shadows that even the military couldn't control it. And worse, Steele had the resources, the training and the loyalty of men who had been burned by the system. If Peter wanted to save Emily, he couldn't just fight Steele. He had to dismantle him. But first, he needed to know how deep this ran. Peter and Alex drove in silence, the hum of the truck's engine the only sound between them. They weren't heading back home. That was no longer an option. Peter's house had become a compromised battlefield. Steele's men had already been there once. If they had eyes on him, they'd come again. Alex finally spoke. So what's the play? Peter stared ahead, his hands gripping the wheel. Boone said Steele's operation runs deeper than just ex-soldiers. He's getting help from inside the system. That means someone high up is keeping him protected. Alex's jaw tightened. A mole, more than one, Peter said. And if Steele has people inside the military, inside intelligence, then every move I make could already be compromised. Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. You think it's someone we know? Peter didn't answer. He didn't want to think that. But Steele had been one of them once. A leader, a war hero. If he had managed to disappear and build this, it wasn't just because he was good. It was because someone let him. And that meant Steele's reach extended far beyond some hidden airstrip and a gang of mercenaries. Peter finally turned onto a back road leading toward a small cabin. It wasn't much, just an old hunting lodge that had been abandoned for years. It was off the grid, away from Steele's surveillance. They needed a place to regroup. Peter parked the truck, and the two of them stepped out, moving through the trees toward the cabin. The air was cold, the silence heavy. Alex unlocked the door first, stepping inside. Dust coated the wooden floors, the scent of old wood and damp earth thick in the air. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Peter shut the door behind them, locking it. Alex turned. All right, so we've got a rogue military faction, a leader who faked his own death, and a government that may or may not be letting it happen. What's our next step? Peter unzipped his jacket, setting his gun on the table. We flush out Steele's contacts. If he has someone high up feeding him intel, we find them, we cut them off. Alex exhaled. And how the hell do we do that? Peter met his gaze. We make them come to us. Alex raised a brow. You're going to have to explain that one. Peter leaned against the table, his voice calm. calculated. Steele took Emily because he wants me to turn. He's counting on me to walk away from the military, to fold. But the people protecting him, the ones feeding him information, they don't know if I've agreed to it yet. That gives us an opening. Alex's eyes narrowed. You're talking about setting a trap. Peter nodded. We leak a message. Make it look like I'm considering Steele's offer, that I'm reaching out to someone on the inside to smooth things over before I make my move. Alex was already shaking his head. That's risky as hell, Pete. If they believe you, they might just put a bullet in your back instead of waiting for you to switch sides. Peter didn't waver. Then we do it right. We make it just convincing enough. We need them to show their hand. If they reach out to Steele, if they try to confirm anything, we track it. We find out who's helping him. Alex let out a breath, rubbing his face. Jesus, you really think this'll work? Peter's voice was cold. It has to. It didn't take long to get the bait in the water. Peter had Alex make the first move, contacting an old intelligence officer they both knew, someone who was loyal but just connected enough to raise flags in the right circles. The message was simple. Caldwell's in deep, thinking about cutting a deal, needs assurances. Then they waited. Hours passed, stretching into the next day. The radio remained silent. No phone calls, no movement. And then, finally, a response. A secure message buried through 3 layers of encryption. A single line, stand by, confirmation required. Alex exhaled. They bought it. Peter's expression didn't change. Now we find out who they really are. It took less than 12 hours for Steele's people to react. Peter and Alex tracked the digital footprint, watching as their planted message rippled through the system. Someone had flagged it. Someone had sent it up the chain, and then, just like that, a name surfaced, Colonel Robert Langley. Peter's stomach turned. Langley had been a rising star in military intelligence, a man with clearance so high that very few people even knew what he had access to. If he was tied to Steele, then this wasn't just about some off-the-books mercenary army. This was systemic. Alex read the name again, shaking his head. This guy has access to more classified data than anyone. You're telling me he's working with Steele? Peter's hands curled into fists. It's the only thing that makes sense. Langley had the power to erase Steele from existence. He had the means to bury information, to redirect attention, to protect Steele's network from the inside. And most importantly, he had the ability to make Peter disappear too. Alex exhaled sharply. All right, so we found our mole. Now what? Peter's gaze was sharp, unyielding. Now we use him. The meeting was set at a private airfield, well outside the city limits. It was Langley's choice, which meant it was Steele's. Peter didn't bring a gun. He knew better. Steele's people would check him the moment he got there. Instead, he carried nothing but the weight of the choice he had made. The air was heavy as Peter stepped onto the tarmac. A black SUV sat idling nearby, 2 men standing beside it. Langley was waiting. He was older now, his once sharp features softened by years of quiet corruption. His expression was unreadable as Peter approached. You're making the right decision, Langley said smoothly. Peter didn't respond. Langley gestured toward the SUV. Let's talk somewhere more private. Peter took a slow breath. He knew this was a risk. He knew Steele might already have his hand on the trigger. But he had one advantage. They didn't know that Peter wasn't alone. Langley turned toward the car, motioning for Peter to follow, and then, crack! The sound of a rifle split the air. Langley's head snapped back, his body crumpling before he could even register what had happened. A second shot took out one of his men. Peter moved. He spun, diving behind the SUV as chaos erupted around him. A third shot rang out, taking down the last guard. Then silence. Peter looked up. Alex was standing on the rooftop of an adjacent hangar, rifle still smoking. Peter exhaled, turning back to Langley's lifeless body. They had flushed out Steele's inside man. Now it was time to finish what Steele had started. Peter didn't hesitate. He grabbed Langley's body by the collar and dragged it behind the SUV as Alex climbed down from the rooftop, rifle slung over his back. The wind howled across the tarmac, carrying the scent of gasoline and blood. The shots had been loud, and it wouldn't be long before someone came looking. Alex reached him first, kneeling beside Langley's lifeless form, his breath still steady from the precision shots. We need to move. Now, Peter ignored him. He was already going through Langley's pockets, searching for anything, phone, keys, documents. His fingers closed around a small flash drive, hidden in the inner lining of the colonel's jacket. He pulled it free, shoving it into his pocket. "Let's go," he muttered, grabbing the rifle off one of Langley's dead guards. "Before we have company." They sprinted toward the fence line, where Alex had left the truck hidden between two rusted-out hangars. Every step Peter took, his mind was racing. Steele wouldn't wait long to retaliate. Losing Langley wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a direct hit to the infrastructure that had kept Steele's operation safe. That meant they had to assume the worst. Steele would accelerate. Emily was still out there, and now Steele had no reason to keep her alive. The truck bounced over uneven dirt roads, Alex gripping the wheel tight, knuckles white. "That drive better have something on it," he said, eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. "It does," Peter said flatly. Though he hadn't looked at it yet, he didn't have to. Langley wasn't the type to carry anything unless it was valuable, and if Peter knew Steele, that drive held more than just mission details. It held leverage. Peter's eyes scanned the road ahead. "We can't go back to the cabin. It's compromised now." Alex nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. "Then where?" Peter considered the options. They needed somewhere Steele wouldn't expect them to go, somewhere isolated but not too far from the action, a place where they could go through Langley's files without interruption. And then he knew exactly where to go. "Head east," Peter said. "I know a place." The safe house was an old hunting lodge buried deep in the woods, a place Peter had used once before while tracking a rogue operative on US soil. It was off the books, completely untraceable. By the time they reached it, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only shadows stretching through the trees. Alex parked the truck behind the lodge, killing the engine. They moved fast, weapons drawn, clearing the space before settling in. Peter found a dusty old laptop in one of the storage crates. It was slow, but it would do the job. He plugged in Langley's drive and waited as the files loaded. Alex leaned against the table, rubbing a hand over his face. "So what's our next move? We go in guns blazing." Peter didn't look up. "We don't go anywhere until we know what we're dealing with." The screen flickered, and a list of classified documents appeared. Some were encrypted, others labeled with redacted mission logs. But Peter's eyes locked onto a folder labeled Project Eclipse. He clicked it open. Inside were dossiers, names, locations, bank transactions, and at the very top of the list, Morgan Steele. Peter scrolled through quickly. Steele's operation wasn't just about taking contracts, it was bigger than that. His people weren't just mercenaries, they were building a force, a network of former special forces, intelligence officers, and disavowed assets, not just in the US, but overseas, contacts in Eastern Europe, South America, Africa. Some of the names Peter recognized, others he didn't. Steele wasn't running a rogue unit. He was forming his own shadow army. Alex muttered a curse under his breath as he scanned the screen. Jesus, this isn't just a gang. This is something else. Peter's blood ran cold. He kept scrolling until he found a shipment log. Dates, coordinates. Steele had been moving equipment, weapons, vehicles, tech. And then he saw it, a manifest. Tonight's shipment. Peter clicked the file, and an address popped up, a warehouse outside the city limits. That's where Steele would be. Peter exhaled sharply, his decision made. Alex must have sensed it. "You're thinking about hitting it." Peter's voice was like steel. "No, I'm thinking about burning it to the ground." The warehouse loomed ahead, sitting just off a dirt road surrounded by shipping containers and old military crates. Peter and Alex had left the truck a mile back, approaching on foot. Through his scope, Peter could see at least 15 men patrolling the area, armed, alert, Steele's inner circle. And then, through the warehouse window, he saw her, Emily. She was inside, hands tied behind her back, a single guard standing next to her. Peter forced himself to breathe. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. He needed a plan. Alex exhaled. "We've got numbers against us." Peter nodded. "But they don't know we're here." He scanned the area, noting weak points. The fuel reserves were stacked against the far wall, likely for moving the shipments. If they could set a fire, they could cause enough confusion to even the playing field. "Cover me," Peter said. "I'm going in." Alex didn't argue. He positioned himself behind an old stack of crates, rifle at the ready. Peter moved fast, sticking to the shadows, slipping through gaps between the containers until he was at the side of the warehouse. He could hear voices inside, Steele's men laughing, relaxed. They didn't expect an attack. Peter slipped through a back entrance, knife in hand. The first guard never saw it coming. A quick slice, a muffled gasp, and Peter lowered him to the ground without a sound. He moved toward Emily, keeping low. The guard beside her was distracted, his attention on his phone. Peter didn't hesitate. He lunged, knife to throat, pulling the man down before he could make a sound. Emily's eyes went wide as Peter cut her restraints. The moment she was free, she grabbed his face, her hands shaking. "Peter." "No time," he murmured. "Can you walk?" She nodded. Peter pulled his sidearm, handing her the knife. "Stay behind me." They slipped toward the exit, but then a voice. "Leaving so soon, Sergeant?" Peter froze. Steele stood near the entrance, gun raised. Behind him, half a dozen men. Emily tensed behind Peter, gripping his arm. Steele smiled. "I gave you a chance. You should have taken it." Peter's mind raced. 6 against 2, no clean shot, and then, boom! An explosion ripped through the far end of the warehouse. Fire engulfed the fuel reserves. Gunfire erupted. "Alex!" Peter didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emily's hand and ran. Bullets whizzed past them as flames spread, engulfing crates, sending thick smoke curling into the sky. Steele's men shouted orders, scrambling for cover. Peter didn't look back. He pushed forward, toward the exit, toward freedom. Emily was with him. And Steele was about to lose everything. The fire spread fast, swallowing the warehouse in thick black smoke and flames that turned night into day. Peter didn't look back. There was no time to admire the destruction, no time to savor the damage he had inflicted. All that mattered was getting Emily out alive. Gunfire cracked behind them, Steele's men scrambling for position, shouting orders through the chaos. Peter kept his grip firm on Emily's wrist, pulling her through the maze of crates and burning debris, his mind already calculating their escape. "Keep moving," he murmured, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Emily didn't need to be told twice. Her breathing was ragged, but she kept pace, her bare feet barely making a sound against the concrete floor. Peter glanced at her briefly. Her face was streaked with soot, her wrists red from the restraints, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. A sudden burst of movement, a guard stepping out from behind a container. Peter fired first. The shot hit the man in the chest, sending him sprawling. He was already moving before the body hit the ground, scooping up the fallen rifle and tossing it to Emily. "Can you use this?" Emily caught it, checked the chamber with shaking hands, then nodded. "Yeah." "Good. They weren't going out of here defenseless." A voice cut through the chaos. "Peter!" "Steele." Peter cursed under his breath, ducking behind a stack of metal crates, pulling Emily down with him. Flames reflected off the shattered warehouse windows, and through the shifting smoke he could see him. Steele stood just beyond the fire, gun in one hand, his expression unreadable. "You're making a mistake, Sergeant," Steele called out, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "You think this is over? You think burning down one of my shipments changes anything?" Peter didn't answer. He wasn't playing Steele's game. Steele took a slow step forward, his shadow stretching long against the fire. "I gave you an out. I gave you a way to protect her. You could have had a place in something bigger than yourself. Instead, you chose this." Peter clenched his teeth, scanning the area for another way out. The front doors were blocked. Flames and collapsing beams made sure of that. The side exits were their best bet, but Steele had men everywhere. "Come on, Peter," Steele continued, lowering his gun slightly. "Let's stop pretending you're some loyal soldier, fighting for a system that left men like us behind. You know the truth. You've always known." Peter's grip on his weapon tightened. "And what truth is that?" Steele's smirk didn't falter. "That the military used us. That they trained us, sent us to die, then threw us away when we were no longer useful. That's why I left. That's why I built this." He gestured around them. "This isn't a gang, Peter. It's an army. An army that doesn't answer to corrupt politicians or weak commanders." Peter exhaled slowly. Steele believed every word he was saying, and for a moment, Peter understood. Steele had seen what Peter had seen. Brothers left behind, decisions made in offices thousands of miles away that cost men their lives. But understanding wasn't the same as agreeing. "You became the very thing we fought against," Peter said coldly. Steele's smirk faded. A gunshot rang out, cutting the conversation short. Peter barely had time to pull Emily down as a bullet ricocheted off the crate beside them. Steele's men were closing in. "We have to move," Peter said, grabbing Emily's arm. Emily didn't argue. They sprinted toward the side of the warehouse, weaving through the thickening smoke, past burning debris and fallen bodies. Peter kept his gun up, eyes scanning for threats. Alex's voice came through his earpiece, barely audible over the chaos. "Pete, northeast corner, I've got a truck. Get to me now." Peter didn't hesitate. "Move!" They turned sharply, cutting across a section of the warehouse that was seconds from collapse. The heat was suffocating, flames licking at their heels. The side door was in sight. 2 guards stepped into view, rifles raised. Emily didn't wait. She fired first, 2 quick shots, dropping one instantly. The second man staggered, turning his weapon on her. Peter was faster. He fired a single round. The guard crumpled. They reached the door, shoving it open, just as another explosion rocked the building. The fire had reached the fuel reserves. The force of the blast sent them both sprawling onto the dirt outside. Alex's truck was ahead, engine running. Peter pushed himself up, grabbing Emily by the arm and pulling her toward the vehicle. They were almost there, and then a sharp pain tore through his shoulder. The impact spun him sideways, the ground slamming into him hard. Emily screamed his name, dropping beside him. Peter gritted his teeth, pressing a hand against the wound, a clean shot through the shoulder. It burned, but he'd had worse. Steele stood near the burning warehouse, lowering his smoking gun. Even through the chaos, his voice was clear. "You should have listened, Peter." Emily raised her rifle, finger on the trigger, but Peter grabbed her wrist before she could fire. "Go," he rasped. "Get in the truck." She hesitated. Another gunshot whizzed past them. Alex leaned out of the truck window, returning fire. "Move!" Emily didn't wait this time. She hooked her arm under Peter's, hauling him up. They staggered toward the truck as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Peter barely registered the pain as Alex yanked the door open, dragging him inside. Emily jumped into the back. The tires screeched against the dirt as Alex floored it, tearing down the road just as the warehouse collapsed behind them. Peter forced himself to stay conscious, his vision blurred, blood soaking through his shirt. Emily pressed a hand against his wound, panic in her eyes. "Stay with me," she whispered. Peter clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. Alex's voice was tight. "That went well." Peter let out a pained chuckle. "It could have been worse." Alex shook his head. "Steele's not going to let this go." Peter exhaled slowly, fighting the pain. He already knew that. Steele had let him go before because he thought Peter could be turned. That wouldn't happen again. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The truck hurtled down the back roads, tires skidding on loose gravel as Alex pushed the engine harder than it was meant to go. Emily kept pressure on Peter's wound, her hands slick with his blood. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright, to keep his focus. "Keep talking," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. Peter exhaled through the pain. "I'm fine," Alex snorted. "Yeah? You look like you just got hit by a truck." Peter gave him a weak smirk. "Feels about the same." The adrenaline was fading and the full force of the injury was setting in. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, but the bleeding was bad. Too much, too fast. "We need to stop and patch him up," Emily said. Alex shook his head, eyes locked on the road. "Not yet. We need distance. Steele's people will be looking for us." Peter forced himself to focus, his mind pushing through the haze. Where are we heading?" Alex hesitated. "Safe house, one of mine." "It's not far." Peter didn't argue. He didn't have a choice. He leaned his head back against the seat, letting the darkness at the edges of his vision creep a little closer. The truck finally pulled off the road, bumping down a narrow dirt path surrounded by thick trees. The safe house was barely more than a cabin, hidden beneath a canopy of branches, but it was isolated. That was all that mattered. Alex killed the engine. "We're here." Emily was already pulling Peter's arm over her shoulder, helping him out of the truck. He grunted as the movement sent fire through his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, but it was stocked. Medical supplies, weapons, gear. Emily guided Peter onto a chair, while Alex grabbed a first aid kit. "Shirt off," Emily ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. Peter bit back a groan as she helped pull his blood-soaked shirt over his head. The bullet hole in his shoulder was still oozing, the surrounding skin an angry red. Alex handed Emily a bottle of whiskey. "Best I can do for sterilization." Peter took it before she could, and downed a swig. The burn was sharp, but it was nothing compared to what was coming. Emily poured the whiskey over the wound, and Peter sucked in a sharp breath as it seared through him. His knuckles went white against the chair arms. "Almost done," Emily murmured, her hands steady as she cleaned and dressed the wound. Peter's breathing slowed as the worst of the pain dulled to a heavy ache. Alex leaned against the wall, arms crossed. So, what's the next move? Peter forced his brain to work through the fog. Steele knows we're not dead. That means he'll come after us. Emily sat back, shaking her head. He won't stop. Peter nodded. No, and that means we hit him first. Alex exhaled. You're still bleeding, man. I'll live, Peter said, adjusting the bandage. We have the files from Langley. We know Steele's operation isn't just about running mercenary jobs. He's moving something bigger, weapons, maybe something worse. We need to find out where and shut it down. Emily frowned. And how do we do that without getting killed? Peter's jaw clenched. We need someone on the inside. Alex scoffed. Yeah? And who the hell is dumb enough to turn on Steele? Peter's eyes darkened. Boone. Boone didn't look happy to see them. The old merc sat in the back of a dingy bar, a half-finished beer in front of him, his expression wary as Peter and Alex slid into the booth across from him. Emily stayed by the entrance, watching for trouble. You two have a death wish, Boone muttered, taking a sip. Peter didn't blink. You said Steele was building something. I need to know where his next shipment is moving. Boone let out a humorless laugh. You think I know that? Peter leaned forward and, voice low, I think you know more than you're saying. Boone's eyes flicked to the bandage on Peter's shoulder. Looks like you already found out the hard way. Peter's patience was wearing thin. We took out one of his warehouses, but Steele's operation isn't just local. He's got shipments moving internationally. If we don't stop him now, we lose our only chance. Boone sighed, rubbing his jaw. You don't get it, do you? Steele doesn't just run a crew. He owns the people around him. Guys like Langley, just the tip of the iceberg. There are senators, private military contractors, people with too much money to care about the bodies they leave behind. Peter's stomach tightened. Who? Boone hesitated. Then finally he exhaled. There's a shipment, Steele's biggest yet. It's moving through an airstrip 2 nights from now. High security. Whatever's inside. It's worth more than anything he's moved before. Alex tensed. And you know this how? Boone's smirk was bitter. Because Steele asked me to be there. Silence settled between them. Peter leaned back, considering the implications. Boone wasn't just some loose end. Steele still trusted him. And if that was the case, Peter exhaled. You're going to help us get in? Boone let out a dry laugh. Oh yeah? And what happens when Steele figures out I sold him out? You disappear, Peter said flatly. We make sure of it. Boone studied him for a long moment. Then finally he let out a breath. Screw it. You're going to get me killed anyway. The airstrip sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest and patrolled by heavily armed men. Through his binoculars, Peter could see military-grade trucks, crates being loaded onto a cargo plane. Steele's expecting me inside, Boone muttered, shifting uncomfortably. But you two, you're going to need to get creative. Peter glanced at Alex. We move through the tree line, get close before they power up the plane. Alex nodded. And then, Peter's grip tightened around his rifle. We stop the shipment, and we make damn sure Steele never moves another one. Emily touched his arm. You're hurt, Peter. He looked at her, his voice steady. That doesn't matter. Emily's eyes burned. It does to me. Peter's fingers brushed against hers for the briefest second. I promise I'll come back. She swallowed hard, then gave a tight nod. Then let's finish this. Boone sighed. You people are insane. Peter smirked. You're just figuring that out? The plan was simple. Get in. Destroy the shipment. Kill Steele if necessary. No more running, no more hiding. This was the breaking point. And by the end of the night, Steele's empire would burn. The wind cut through the night as Peter moved through the tree line, his breath slow, controlled. Every muscle in his body ached, his wound still raw beneath the hastily wrapped bandages. But pain didn't matter. Not now. Not when they were this close. Through the scope of his rifle, he watched Boone make his way toward the airstrip, moving like a man who had nothing left to lose. He had cleaned up, put on his best, loyal soldier face, and walked straight into the fire. Peter's grip on his rifle tightened. If Boone sold them out, if this was a setup, then this night would end in a bloodbath. Next to him, Alex adjusted his position, keeping his own sights trained on the hangar. This place is crawling with guards, he muttered. Peter didn't respond. He was already counting. 2 stationed near the plane, another 4 patrolling the perimeter, 2 more at the entrance to the warehouse, 8 visible, more inside. His earpiece crackled as Boone's voice came through. "I'm in. Steele's not here yet, but his top guys are. Shipment's already loaded on the plane." Peter narrowed his eyes. "What are we dealing with?" Boone hesitated. "It's not just weapons, man. It's worse. I got a glimpse at the manifest." Another pause. "They're moving people." Peter's blood went cold. "Say that again." Boone exhaled. "There are prisoners in the warehouse. Don't know how many, but they're being transported with the shipment." Peter's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. This wasn't just a weapons deal, it was trafficking. Alex swore under his breath. "Steele's running human cargo now?" Boone's voice was grim. "I told you this was bigger than a mercenary outfit." Peter's mind raced, adjusting the plan in seconds. Taking out Steele's weapons was one thing, but if there were people inside that warehouse, men, women, maybe even kids, this mission had just changed. They weren't here to burn it down, they were here to save them. "New plan," Peter said, his voice razor-sharp. "Boone, get inside the warehouse. Find out how many are in there." Boone hesitated. "And if they catch me looking?" Peter's tone was ice. "Then we make sure they never look again." Boone cursed but didn't argue. The radio went silent as he moved. Alex shifted beside him. "We need to go in sooner than planned." Peter nodded. "We wait for Boone's signal. The second we have a number, we go loud." The minutes stretched long, the tension coiling in Peter's chest like a spring ready to snap. Then, finally, Boone's voice returned, low and urgent. 7 hostages, all restrained. Some look injured." Peter adjusted his rifle, heart hammering. "Can you get them out?" "No, locked inside. Heavy security." Boone's breathing was sharp, tense. "You guys need to move. Steele's en route." Peter didn't wait. "Alex, take the left side. I'll move through the hangar." Emily's voice cut in through the earpiece, tight with worry. "Peter, I'll be fine," he said quickly. "Stay in position." He moved fast, staying low, closing the distance between the tree line and the hangar's edge. The guards at the entrance were focused on the incoming plane, its engines roaring as it began to descend. Perfect timing. Alex took the first shot, a single suppressed round. The nearest guard dropped. Peter moved on the second, knife in hand, closing the distance before the man even knew he was there. One swift movement, blade to throat, and he was down. They were in. Peter ducked inside the hangar. Steele's men were distracted, their attention on the plane. They had no idea death had already stepped through their doors. His earpiece crackled. "Warehouse secured. I've got the keys," Boone reported. "Moving to the hostages." Peter adjusted course. "We'll cover you." Another guard stepped into view. Peter fired twice, center mass, and the man crumpled. Alex took out another before he could raise the alarm. The chaos started seconds later. Someone spotted the bodies. Shouts erupted. The base came alive. Peter grabbed his radio. "Emily, get ready to move." Gunfire tore through the hangar. Alex ducked behind cover, firing back. "They know we're here!" Peter fired 2 more shots, taking down another hostile. "Keep them distracted!" Boone's voice cut through. "I've got the prisoners. We're moving. Shit!" Peter's stomach dropped. "What?" "Boone, report! They've got reinforcements coming in. Trucks pulling up from the north side." Peter cursed. They had minutes, maybe less. "Get those people out. We'll handle the rest." Boone didn't argue. Peter and Alex moved in tandem, covering the warehouse entrance as Boone led the hostages out. 7 frightened, beaten men and women, eyes wide with terror. Peter's voice was firm. "Move fast. Follow Boone." Then, through the smoke, Steele emerged. He wasn't running. He wasn't shouting orders. He walked with purpose, his expression unreadable, a gun in his hand, but lowered. Peter raised his own, aiming for Steele's head. Steele stopped, studying him. "You should have taken my offer." Peter didn't blink. "And you should have stayed buried." Steele exhaled, shaking his head. "You think you won something tonight?" Peter didn't answer. Steele smirked. "You don't even know who you're really fighting." Peter pulled the trigger. Steele moved. The bullet grazed his arm, but he was already diving for cover. Gunfire exploded between them. Alex laid down suppressive fire as Peter moved, closing the gap, keeping Steele pinned. Then, over the gunfire, Steele laughed. "Peter, Peter, Peter," his voice echoed. "You think this is just about me? About some rogue soldiers making a few million off dirty contracts?" Peter's grip tightened. "Keep him talking." "This is bigger than me," Steele continued, his voice almost amused. "Bigger than you, bigger than anything you're prepared for." Peter's jaw clenched. "You talk too much." Steele smirked. "That's because I already won." Then Peter heard it. Another set of engines. Not just one plane, two. Another aircraft coming in from the opposite direction. Peter's stomach sank. The real shipment. Steele grinned. You were a distraction. Peter's radio crackled. Boone. Pete, we got a problem. Another plane just landed. Peter's mind raced. This had been the real play. Steele had sacrificed this warehouse, let Peter destroy it, because the bigger operation was still moving, and now Peter was out of time. He made a split-second decision. Boone, get those people out. Pete, that's an order. Peter's gun snapped up. He fired 3 times. Steele staggered, his expression finally changing as 2 bullets hit their mark. He fell hard, clutching his bleeding side. Peter didn't stay to watch. He turned, sprinting toward the airstrip, toward the second plane, toward the real enemy, because Steele wasn't the mastermind. He was just another pawn. And now, Peter was about to meet the real players. Peter ran, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder, ignoring the chaos behind him. The real shipment was on the second plane. And if Steele had been a distraction, then Peter had just wasted time he didn't have. Alex's voice cracked through his earpiece. Pete, the hostages are out. We're moving them now. Peter didn't have time to respond. He sprinted toward the second aircraft, the roar of its engines vibrating through the ground. The cargo bay doors were still open, and shadowed figures moved inside, securing the load. Weapons, technology, people. Peter gritted his teeth, lifting his rifle as he slid into cover behind a stack of crates. He counted quickly, 4 guards outside, 2 more inside the plane. Not impossible odds, but he was already bleeding, already drained. He needed leverage, a distraction. He flicked the switch on his last flashbang, pulling the pin. 1 heartbeat. 2. He threw it toward the cargo bay. The grenade clattered against metal, bouncing once before exploding in a blinding white flash. Shouts. Confusion. Peter moved. The first guard barely had time to turn before Peter's knife was buried in his throat. He grabbed the body before it hit the ground, using it as a shield as bullets sprayed through the darkness. Then he dropped it and fired. 1 down. Another round caught the second guard in the leg, sending him sprawling with a scream. Peter pivoted, snapping off 2 more shots, clean kills. The entrance was clear. Inside the cargo bay, the remaining 2 men were still recovering from the flashbang. Peter took the first one before he could reach his weapon. A single bullet to the chest. The second man tried to run. Peter put a round through his knee. The man collapsed, screaming, clutching at his shattered leg. Peter approached, gun still raised. Who's running this operation? The man coughed, blood flecking his lips, but his eyes were defiant. You think you stopped something? He let out a pained laugh. You don't even know what you're in the middle of. Peter pressed the barrel of his rifle against the man's forehead. Who's in charge? The man grinned, teeth bloody. You'll see soon enough. Peter exhaled through his nose. He didn't have time for riddles. He fired once. The body slumped. Peter turned toward the cargo, heart pounding. The crates were marked with nothing but black symbols, no military insignias, no government labels, just untraceable shipments moving through the shadows. He pried one open. Inside were weapons, not standard issue. These were prototypes, gear that should have still been in research labs, not in the hands of a rogue paramilitary group. Peter felt his stomach twist. Steele wasn't just running an army. He was being supplied by someone bigger. A sudden noise snapped his attention back, movement near the cockpit. Someone was still alive. Peter moved fast, stepping over bodies, his rifle aimed at the shadow just beyond the pilot's seat. Hands up, the figure turned. It wasn't a soldier. It was a woman, dressed in a sleek black suit, her hair pulled back, her expression eerily calm despite the gun pointed at her head. She smiled. Sergeant Caldwell, I was wondering when we'd finally meet. Peter didn't lower his weapon. Who the hell are you? The woman exhaled, tilting her head. Right now? The only person who can keep you alive. Peter's finger hovered over the trigger. Try again, she sighed, almost bored. You're playing a game you don't understand, Sergeant. You think Steele is the mastermind? He's just a piece. Peter's pulse quickened. Then who's pulling the strings? Her smirk didn't falter. You already know the answer. Peter's mind raced. The classified weapons. The untouchable network Steele had built. The funding. The political protection. Langley. The inside man. Peter clenched his jaw. This goes all the way up. The woman nodded. Now you're starting to get it. Peter exhaled sharply, his mind adjusting to the new battlefield. This wasn't just about Steele. This was about who was using him. He kept his aim steady. "If you work for them, why are you here?" The woman shrugged. "Because Steele made a mistake. He underestimated you, and now you've become a problem." Peter's eyes darkened. "And what do problems get?" She smiled. "Options." Peter didn't trust her. Not for a second, but he needed answers. He needed a way in. Emily's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Peter, are you clear?" He hesitated. The woman's gaze flickered. "That's your wife, isn't it?" Peter's jaw clenched. The woman nodded as if she had already known. "Then you should listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." Peter didn't move. The woman's voice was smooth, controlled. "Steele is already dead. Whether by your hands or by ours, it doesn't matter. But the people above him, the ones who really run this show, they've been watching you." Peter's grip tightened. "And now they want to make you an offer." Silence. Peter exhaled. "I'm not for sale." The woman chuckled softly. "That's what Steele thought too. Look where he is now." Peter's stomach coiled with rage. "And if I say no?" Her smile didn't waver. "Then you'll die, and so will your wife." The words hung in the air, heavy. Peter fought the urge to pull the trigger. He could end this now. He could put a bullet between her eyes and walk away, but he wouldn't get another chance. If this really went all the way up, then he needed to see it. He needed to tear it down from the inside. So he did the hardest thing he had ever done. He lowered his gun. The woman's smirk widened. "Smart choice, Sergeant." Peter's voice was cold. "What's the next move?" She stepped forward, handing him a small black phone. "You'll get a call in 24 hours. If you answer, we'll know where you stand." Peter took the phone, but didn't look away from her. "And if I don't?" She shrugged. "Then we'll assume you're no longer useful." Peter's blood boiled, but he didn't react. He had one shot at this. The woman turned to leave. Peter called after her. "What's your name?" She paused at the cargo ramp, then looked back. "Call me Evelyn." Then she disappeared into the darkness. Peter stared at the phone in his hand. He knew what this was. It wasn't just an offer, it was a trap, and if he took the call, there would be no turning back. Emily's voice crackled in his ear again, more urgent this time. "Peter, what's going on?" Peter exhaled, steadying himself. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm going to war." Peter sat in the dark, staring at the small black phone in his hand. It felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of every decision he had made, every life he had taken, was compressed into this one device. The words of the woman, Evelyn, echoed in his head. "You'll get a call in 24 hours. If you answer, we'll know where you stand." He already knew where he stood, but if he answered, it wouldn't be as a recruit. It would be as a spy, a saboteur, a man willing to step into hell itself just to burn it from the inside. He took a slow breath, his mind steadying. This wasn't just about Steele anymore. He was dead, or he would be soon. The real war was against the people above him, the ones who had funded him, protected him, turned him into a necessary evil in their grand design. And Peter had just forced their hand. A soft rustle of movement caught his attention. He turned to see Emily standing in the doorway. Her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You're not really considering this," she said. Peter didn't answer immediately. He set the phone down on the table and rubbed his temples. "It's the only way in." Emily exhaled sharply, stepping closer. "Peter, you just barely got out of that airstrip alive. We should be running, not stepping deeper into this nightmare." He looked up at her, his gaze unwavering. "If we run, they'll never stop. Steele was just one piece of this. They let him exist because he was useful. If we don't cut out the root, this will happen again, and next time, there won't be a way out." Emily's eyes flashed with frustration, but also understanding. She knew he was right. That was the worst part. She lowered her voice. "And what if you go too deep? What if you can't get out?" Peter didn't blink. "Then at least I take some of them with me." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Emily sat down across from him, her fingers tracing a faint scratch on the wooden table. "I just got you back," she whispered. "I can't lose you again." Peter reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "You won't." She held his gaze, and for a brief moment neither of them were soldiers, nor were they prisoners of a war that had already taken too much. They were just Peter and Emily, the way they had been before everything fell apart. Then the moment passed. Alex's voice broke the silence. "The phone's gonna ring soon. What's the plan?" Peter pulled his hand back from Emily's and stood up. His mind had already decided. "We answer." The phone rang exactly at the 24-hour mark. Peter let it ring twice, then picked up. He didn't speak. Evelyn's voice came through, smooth and confident. "You survived." Peter leaned against the wall, his expression blank. "Wasn't easy." "I imagine not," she said. "We expected more resistance from you, but in the end, you see the truth, don't you?" Peter's grip on the phone tightened. "That depends on what the truth is." There was a pause. Then Evelyn spoke again. "Meet me in 1 hour, Warehouse District, alone." The line went dead. Peter exhaled slowly. He turned to Alex and Emily. "We're in." Alex looked at him, his arms crossed. "And by we, I assume you mean you, because there's no way in hell I'm letting you go in there alone." Peter gave him a look. "That's the only way they'll let me in." Alex scowled but didn't argue. Emily, however, did. "I don't like this," she said. "You're not supposed to," Peter replied, grabbing his jacket. She stood up, frustration clear in her eyes. "What if it's a trap?" Peter smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course it's a trap." Then he walked out the door. The warehouse was exactly what Peter expected. Isolated, dark, a place where people disappeared without a trace. 2 men stood by the entrance, their hands resting on concealed weapons. They watched Peter as he approached, their eyes giving nothing away. One of them pulled a radio from his belt and murmured something. A moment later, the large metal doors groaned open. Peter stepped inside. The interior was cold, vast, the air thick with the scent of oil and metal. Stacks of crates lined the walls, and in the center, standing beneath the single overhead light, was Evelyn. She was exactly as composed as before, her expression carefully neutral, but this time she wasn't alone. 3 men flanked her, not Steele's men. These were different, more polished, more controlled, government men. Peter's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. Evelyn smiled slightly. "Welcome to the real war." Peter stopped a few feet away from her, his posture relaxed but ready. "Steele was working for you." Evelyn tilted her head. "Not exactly. We gave him the resources to do what he did. But men like him, they always think they're in control." Peter's jaw clenched. "And now that he's served his purpose?" Evelyn smiled again. "Now we move on." Peter exhaled slowly. "And what do you need me for?" She studied him for a moment, as if gauging how much to say. Then she spoke. "You were right about Steele's operation. It wasn't just a mercenary group. It was a test, a way to see how far we could push certain elements before intervention." Peter forced himself to remain calm. "You used him as a pawn." Evelyn's smile widened. "We use everyone as a pawn." Peter's blood ran cold. He had spent his entire life serving a system that claimed to fight for justice, for freedom. And now, standing here, he realized just how deep the corruption ran. Evelyn took a slow step forward. "The question is, Peter, are you going to keep fighting it, or are you ready to be on the winning side?" Peter met her gaze, every part of him screaming to put a bullet between her eyes, but he didn't, because if he was going to destroy them, he had to play the game first. So after a long pause, he nodded once. "I'm listening." Evelyn's smirk was subtle, but it was there. She had no idea what she had just let in the door, and Peter was going to make sure she regretted it. Peter walked out of the warehouse, his mind an iron trap, holding in the fury that threatened to boil over. The night air was cold against his skin, but he barely felt it. Every step he took away from Evelyn was measured, precise, controlled. She thought she had him. She thought he had folded, that the weight of Steele's death and the vastness of what lay beyond him had crushed the last shred of his defiance. She had no idea. His truck was parked 2 blocks away, half hidden in the shadows of an abandoned loading dock. Alex was waiting inside, the engine running low, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The moment Peter slid into the passenger seat, Alex spoke. "Well?" Peter exhaled, his jaw tight. "They want me in." Alex let out a sharp breath. "And you said yes?" Peter glanced at him. "What else was I supposed to say?" Alex shook his head, rubbing a hand down his face. "Jesus, Pete, these people aren't playing games. You think Steele was bad? You just walked into the belly of the beast." Peter leaned back against the seat, staring at the dark horizon. "I didn't walk in, I was invited, and that's the only reason we're still breathing." Alex let out a dry chuckle. Yeah? And how long do you think that lasts before they figure out you're here to burn the whole thing down? Peter turned to him, his voice steady. Long enough. Alex studied him for a moment, then let out a slow sigh. Emily's not going to like this. Peter closed his eyes briefly. She'll understand. Silence filled the truck. Finally, Alex spoke again. What's the next move? Peter opened his eyes, his expression unreadable. We go deeper. The next meeting came faster than Peter expected. Less than 24 hours after his conversation with Evelyn, the black phone rang again. He picked up on the first ring. Evelyn's voice was smooth as ever. We're moving forward. You'll meet your handler tonight. Be at the coordinates I send in 1 hour. The line clicked dead before Peter could respond. He checked the text a second later. The location was a private airstrip just outside city limits. Alex was already watching him. You trust this? Peter tucked the phone into his pocket. No, but I'm going anyway. Alex shook his head. Of course you are. The airstrip was quiet when Peter arrived. The kind of eerie silence that only existed when something dangerous lurked just beneath the surface. 2 SUVs sat parked near the hangar, their blacked-out windows reflecting the floodlights overhead. A man leaned against the hood of one, arms crossed, watching Peter as he approached. Not Evelyn. Someone new. Peter kept his posture relaxed, his stride even. The man was built like a soldier, his sharp eyes tracking every movement Peter made. Sergeant Caldwell, the man said, pushing off the SUV. His voice was neutral, his stance controlled. Peter didn't respond. He simply waited. The man smirked slightly. No questions? Peter tilted his head. You're my handler. Handle. The man chuckled. I like you already. He extended a hand. Name's Roland. Peter shook it, his grip firm. Roland studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the hangar. Walk with me. Peter followed, his senses sharp. Inside, the hangar was mostly empty, save for a few crates and a single military-grade drone parked near the far end. Peter recognized the model immediately, classified tech, the kind the government didn't just lose unless someone let it happen. Roland caught his gaze. That's what we're moving next. Peter glanced at him. And where's it going? Roland smirked. You don't get to ask those questions yet. Peter nodded slowly, filing the information away. Roland continued walking. You've made an impression, Caldwell. People upstairs want to see if you're really as good as they say. Peter said nothing. Roland stopped near a table, picking up a tablet and sliding it across. Your first job. You complete this, you're in. Peter glanced down. The screen displayed a target's photo. A man in his mid-50s, sharp features, salt and pepper hair, military. Roland's voice was calm. Your target is Colonel David Kane. He's a problem. Peter's stomach turned cold. He knew that name. Kane was one of the last honest men left in the military. He had fought corruption for years, pushing back against everything Steele and his handlers had built. And now they wanted him gone. Roland continued. He's been digging where he shouldn't, asking the wrong questions. Your job is to make sure he stops. Peter forced himself to breathe evenly. And if I say no? Roland smiled slightly. Then we assume you're not on our side. Peter exhaled slowly, lifting the tablet and memorizing every detail of the target's face. Then he set it back down. When? Roland's smirk widened. Tomorrow night. Peter nodded once. Then he walked away. Back at the safe house, Alex and Emily waited, both of them tense the moment Peter stepped through the door. Emily stood first. What happened? Peter pulled out his knife and slammed it into the wooden table. They want me to kill Colonel Kane. Silence. Alex swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. Jesus Christ! Emily's face paled. You're not actually considering it. Peter's expression was like stone. I need to get close. This is the only way. Emily shook her head. Peter, if you kill him, I'm not going to. His voice was calm, but firm. I'm going to warn him. Alex let out a slow breath. That's risky. Peter met his gaze. Everything about this is risky. Emily exhaled, her hands balling into fists. Then what's the plan? Peter's eyes burned with cold fire. We make them think I did it. Alex raised an eyebrow. How? Peter turned the blade of his knife, watching the light glint off the metal. We stage the hit. Make it look real. Kane disappears, and they think I followed through. Emily's voice was soft but sharp. And if they find out? Peter finally looked up. Then we're already dead. The next night, Peter stood outside Kane's safe house, his heart steady, his hands sure. The colonel was inside, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Peter exhaled, his mind set. By the time this was over, the world would think Kane was dead. And when his enemies let their guard down, that's when they'd strike. The night was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones. Peter stood outside the colonel's safe house, hidden beneath the cover of darkness, his body still, his mind working through the plan for the 100th time. There was no room for error. If he slipped up, if Kane hesitated, if the wrong person was watching, then this whole mission would go up in flames. He took a slow breath, forcing his heartbeat to remain steady. Inside that house was a man who had spent his entire career fighting corruption, pushing back against the very forces that were now coming for his life. Kane wasn't perfect, no soldier was, but he was one of the last good ones. A man who had refused to sell his soul when so many others had. And now, Peter had to kill him. At least that's what the world had to believe. Peter moved swiftly, picking the lock on the back door in under 3 seconds. He slipped inside, keeping his movements careful, quiet. The layout was simple. One story, a handful of rooms, dim lighting. Kane was careful, but he wasn't paranoid. Not paranoid enough. Peter stepped through the hall, his silencer already attached to his sidearm. He wasn't planning to use it, but it had to look real. He reached the living room and saw Kane sitting at a desk, eyes scanning over documents, a half-drunk cup of coffee beside him. The man had aged, silver streaks lining his once dark hair, lines deepening his face, but his posture was still strong. He wasn't broken, not yet. Peter stepped forward. Kane's instincts were still sharp. He turned fast, reaching for a weapon hidden beneath the papers, but Peter was faster. "Don't," Peter said, his voice low. Kane froze, his sharp gaze locking onto Peter. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The air between them was charged, years of unspoken understanding in a single glance. "You here to kill me, son?" Kane asked, his voice even. Peter exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon just enough to make a point. "No, but they need to think I did." Kane studied him, his mind working just as quickly. "Who sent you?" Peter hesitated. "Evelyn." Kane's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then they really are cleaning house." Peter nodded. "They're tying up loose ends. You're a threat to them, but if we do this right, you'll be dead to the world before they can finish the job themselves." Kane leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "And what's your play in all of this?" Peter's grip tightened on his gun. "I'm on the inside now. If I can make them believe I'm one of them, I can dismantle this from within." Kane studied him for a long time, then let out a small chuckle. "Hell of a gamble, son." Peter didn't blink. "It's the only one I've got." Kane glanced at the clock, then back at Peter. "All right, let's make me disappear." The execution had to be perfect. Peter spent the next 30 minutes making it look real. A single bullet fired into the back of the chair Kane had been sitting in. Blood, not Kane's, but taken from an old combat wound he let Peter reopen. Splattered just enough to make it convincing. The documents on the desk were burned, the coffee cup knocked over as if it had happened in an instant. Then came the body. Peter and Kane had prepared a switch, a corpse from an old military morgue that had been quietly collected through one of Alex's contacts. The resemblance was close enough, and after some fire and stage damage, the body was left in Kane's place. The house was rigged to burn within minutes after Peter left. By the time the flames consumed what was left of the room, Kane would be officially dead. Peter stepped back, surveying the scene. It was perfect. Kane exhaled slowly, pulling a hood over his head. "You sure about this?" Peter nodded. "They'll see what they want to see." Kane gave him a long look, then held out a hand. Peter shook it, gripping tightly. "Don't get yourself killed, son," Kane said. Peter smirked faintly. "No promises." And then Kane was gone. Peter stayed just long enough to watch the flames take hold, the glow of the fire spreading through the windows. The smoke curled into the sky, a dark signal to those watching. It was done. The report came the next morning. Colonel David Kane, traitor to the state, liability to national security, was dead. Shot in his own home, burned beyond recognition. A clean hit. Peter sat in the back of an armored SUV, the black phone in his hand, as Evelyn's voice came through the speaker. "Well done, Sergeant," she said, her tone pleased. You did what Steele never could. Peter's grip on the phone tightened. He didn't deserve a trial. No, Evelyn agreed. He didn't. Peter kept his face neutral, his posture steady. What's next? Evelyn let out a small chuckle. Eager. I like that. The SUV turned onto a private road leading toward a facility Peter didn't recognize. It was isolated, fortified, military grade. Evelyn continued, You've proven yourself. Now, it's time for you to see just how deep this war really goes. Peter exhaled slowly, his heart a steady drumbeat in his chest. He was in. Now, he had to destroy them from within. The facility was unlike anything Peter had seen before. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't an ordinary military installation. It was something else. Men in black tactical gear, unmarked vehicles, surveillance systems that were beyond government issue. This wasn't just an operation. This was an entire infrastructure. Evelyn stepped out of the SUV first, motioning for Peter to follow. This is where the real work begins, she said, as they walked toward the entrance. Peter glanced at the guards. Who are these men? Evelyn smirked. You'll learn soon enough. They passed through multiple security checkpoints, each more advanced than the last. Fingerprint scans, retinal scans, encrypted passcodes. Finally, they reached a room lined with digital displays, showing live feeds of operations all over the world. Peter's stomach tightened. Evelyn turned to him, her expression unreadable. You still think you're fighting Steele's war? Peter exhaled. I think I'm seeing the whole picture now. Evelyn smiled. Good. Then she gestured toward one of the screens. Peter's blood turned to ice. It was a live feed of Emily. She was at the safe house, sitting near the window, unaware that a drone was watching her from above. Peter forced his muscles to remain relaxed, his face unreadable. Evelyn studied him. You've done well so far, but we need full commitment. Peter turned to her, his voice steady. What do you need me to do? Evelyn's smile widened. There's a man we need removed, and this time we don't want him dead. Peter's jaw clenched. Who? Evelyn's eyes gleamed. His name is Alex. The world tilted. Peter kept his breathing steady, his expression blank. This was it, the moment they would know if he was truly one of them. He exhaled slowly, his mind already forming a plan. He had 24 hours before they expected Alex to be gone. 24 hours before he either delivered his friend to them or made his own move. The war had never been clearer, and the cost of vengeance had never been higher. Peter sat in the sterile, dimly lit room, the weight of Evelyn's last words pressing down on him like a vice. Alex. They wanted Alex. Every instinct told him that this was the final test, the moment that would prove whether he was truly one of them. They had already watched him kill Kane, and now they were pushing further. They wanted him to betray someone who had been beside him through the worst of it all. He forced his breathing to stay even, his face unreadable. Evelyn watched him closely, her cold, calculating gaze peeling away every layer of deception he had built. She expected hesitation, she expected doubt, so he gave her nothing. Peter nodded slowly. Where do you need him? Evelyn's lips curved into a satisfied smirk. There's a facility, a holding site just outside the city. Bring him there. Alive. Peter tilted his head slightly. And after that? Evelyn gave a small chuckle. That's not your concern. Peter exhaled slowly, forcing himself to play the role. Understood. She studied him for another moment, then stood, smoothing out the fabric of her suit. You have 24 hours. Make it clean. She walked toward the door, stopping just before exiting. Without turning around, she spoke again. And Peter? He looked up. If you fail, we won't need to watch Emily anymore. A quiet threat, delivered in the same effortless tone she used for everything else. Then she was gone. The door shut behind her, leaving Peter in silence. For a long moment he sat there, hands resting on the table, his mind a storm. Then, slowly, he stood and walked out. He had 24 hours, and he had to decide whether to save his best friend or risk losing everything. The drive back to the safe house was silent. Peter's grip on the wheel was tight, his jaw clenched. Alex was waiting when he arrived, standing near the truck, arms crossed. Peter barely got out before Alex spoke. You gonna tell me what happened, or do I have to guess? Peter exhaled, stepping closer. He didn't look at Emily, who was watching from the cabin window. She already knew something was wrong. They want you, Peter said simply. Alex's eyes darkened. Define want. Peter turned, facing him fully. They want me to bring you in, alive. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Alex let out a slow, bitter chuckle. Guess I should be flattered. Peter's hands curled into fists at his sides. I have to make it look real. Alex's smirk faded. You mean you have to make it real? Peter didn't flinch. I won't let them have you. Alex exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. Yeah? And what's your plan? Walk me in, give me a pat on the back, and then we all just hope it works out. Peter shook his head. No, we fake it. We make them believe they have you. Make them. Just long enough for me to get deeper inside. Alex's jaw clenched. And what happens if they figure out it's a setup? Peter didn't have an answer. Alex scoffed, running a hand through his hair. You should have never gotten involved in this, Pete. Peter stepped closer, his voice quiet, but sharp. If I hadn't, Emily would be dead, and now we have a chance to tear them down from the inside. Alex's eyes met his. Or they tear you down first. Emily finally stepped outside, her voice cutting through the tension. So what do we do? Peter turned to her. We go dark. The next few hours were spent erasing everything. Peter and Alex wiped their phones, scrubbed any traceable data, rerouted surveillance feeds, and set up a false trail. Emily packed only the essentials. They were about to disappear. Peter made the call just before midnight. The black phone rang once before Evelyn picked up. Report. Peter's voice was steady. I have him. Moving to your location. A pause, then, good. The line went dead. Peter exhaled slowly, tucking the phone away. Alex sat across from him, staring out at the empty road. This is insane. Peter didn't argue. They drove in silence, heading toward the location Evelyn had given them. A holding site, not an execution site, which meant they wanted Alex for something. Information, leverage. And Peter had every intention of making sure they got neither. The facility was exactly what Peter expected. Remote, cold, the kind of place where people disappeared. Armed guards stood at the perimeter, their eyes scanning the area as Peter pulled up. He stepped out first, his posture calm, his movements deliberate. Alex was behind him, hands bound. Fake restraints, but they wouldn't know that. A man approached, dressed in tactical gear, his face unreadable. Not Evelyn, someone lower on the chain. Caldwell, the man greeted. Right on time. Peter gave a short nod. Where do you want him? The man gestured toward the entrance. Inside. Peter moved, guiding Alex forward, one step at a time. Inside, the facility was even colder. Concrete floors, steel doors, a place designed for control. They reached a holding room, empty except for a single chair bolted to the floor. The man turned to Peter. We'll take it from here. Peter nodded slowly. Evelyn will want confirmation. The man smirked. We'll give her one. He reached for Alex's arm. And that's when Peter moved. A single step, a shift in weight. Then he struck. His elbow snapped into the guard's throat before the man could react. The sound was wet, sharp, and the man went down fast, choking on his own breath. Alex spun, grabbing another guard's weapon before he could draw it. Peter pulled his gun, silencer already attached. 3 shots, 3 bodies hit the floor. Alarms started blaring. Alex exhaled. So much for subtle. Peter grabbed a keycard from one of the fallen men. We don't need subtle anymore. They moved fast, clearing the halls, taking out anyone in their way. Peter could hear reinforcements arriving. They had minutes. Alex kicked open a door, a control room. Peter moved to the main console, accessing security feeds, and then he saw it, files, documents, a list of names. Not just Steele's operation, the entire network. Peter inserted a drive, copying everything. This is it. Alex was already moving. Then let's get the hell out of here. Peter pulled the drive, stuffing it into his vest. They sprinted down the corridor, bullets tearing through the air behind them. Peter saw the exit, then a voice over the intercom. Calm, cold. Evelyn. You disappoint me, Peter. Peter didn't stop. The doors burst open and they ran into the night. The first step of bringing it all down had begun. The cold air cut through Peter like a blade as he and Alex ran into the dark, gunfire cracking behind them. Their boots pounded against the damp earth, adrenaline pushing them forward. Every breath was sharp, every second stretched thin. Peter's mind worked through their dwindling options. They had what they came for, the files, the names, the proof. But none of it mattered if they didn't make it out alive. Alex veered left, leading them toward the tree line beyond the compound. The facility had been isolated by design, surrounded by open terrain, but they had scouted their escape route before stepping into this fire. Peter kept his gun raised as they ran, firing blindly toward the shadows moving behind them. The guards were trained, but they weren't prepared for this kind of chaos. Their formation was sloppy, their shots rushed. Still, they weren't slowing down. Alex dove behind a fallen tree, reloading. "You got a plan? Or are we just running till they get tired?" Peter crouched next to him, ejecting his spent magazine. "We have to split up." Alex glanced at him, breathing hard. "That's a terrible plan." Peter smirked despite the situation. "You got a better one?" Alex sighed, checking his ammo. "I hate when you do this." Peter handed him a flash drive, the backup copy. "Get this to Emily, she'll know what to do." Alex hesitated, his expression unreadable. "And what about you?" Peter looked past the trees toward the floodlights, searching for them. "I'm staying." Alex's jaw tightened. "No!" Peter grabbed his shoulder. "Yes." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "They're expecting us to run. If I stay, I can keep them focused on me. You get out, you make sure this all goes public." Alex stared at him for a long moment. Then he exhaled sharply and tucked the drive into his vest. "You better not die, Caldwell." Peter gave him a small nod. "I'll do my best." Then, without another word, Alex moved, keeping low, disappearing into the night. Peter turned back toward the facility, gripping his rifle. Time to finish this. Peter didn't run. He moved toward the enemy. He circled wide, staying in the shadows, moving fast and quiet through the trees. He could hear the guards shouting, barking orders. They had lost track of him and Alex. Good. Peter raised his rifle, lining up a shot. The nearest guard barely saw it coming before the bullet took him in the chest. Another turned, confused, and Peter dropped him before he could fire. Chaos erupted. Peter sprinted toward the facility's perimeter, knowing exactly what he needed to do. If he couldn't bring the whole place down, he could still cripple it. His target was the communications tower. If he cut them off, they'd be blind, deaf, no reinforcements, no outside help, just him and them. Peter reached the base of the tower, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. 2 guards stood at the entrance, weapons raised. They weren't expecting him to come at them head-on. He took the first shot. The guard dropped. The second managed to fire back, but Peter moved before the shot could land. He closed the distance fast, slamming his elbow into the man's throat, then driving his knee into his ribs. The guard crumpled, wheezing. Peter didn't waste a bullet. He grabbed the man's own knife and finished it quickly. Then he stepped inside the comms room. It was a mess of wires and old equipment, military grade, but old. He had minutes at most before someone realized he was here. Peter pulled out an incendiary charge from his vest, setting it against the main server stack. A few keystrokes later, he started a hard wipe of their data. If the files he had stolen weren't enough, he was making damn sure there was nothing left to salvage. Footsteps. Peter turned just as a guard rushed in. Too late. Peter pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the room. Another set of footsteps, more coming. Peter pressed the detonator and sprinted for the exit. The explosion ripped through the tower behind him, heat chasing him as he hit the dirt. The fire caught fast, spreading through the network of cables and equipment. The facility was officially blind. Peter pushed himself up, scanning the area. Now he just had to get out alive. He didn't make it far before he heard the helicopter. The deep, chopping sound of rotor blades cutting through the night. Peter's stomach sank. They had backup. He ran, ducking between trees as the spotlight cut through the darkness, searching for him. Bullets tore through the air, shredding bark, kicking up dirt. Peter gritted his teeth, pushing forward. He wasn't dying here. He could hear vehicles approaching, men shouting orders. He was outnumbered, outgunned. He had nothing left but his rifle and his training. And then a gunshot rang out from the other direction. Peter turned, heart hammering. More shots, not aimed at him, at them. Peter kept moving, reaching the ridge just as a familiar truck skidded onto the dirt road below. The driver's side door flew open. Emily. Her eyes locked onto him through the night, and without hesitation, she threw a rifle out the window. Peter caught it. Then he turned and started firing. The fight was a blur of gunfire and adrenaline. Peter and Emily cut through their pursuers, moving as one. The guards were disoriented, their comms still down from the explosion. They weren't prepared for a counterattack. By the time Peter reached the truck, the remaining men were retreating. Emily yanked the door open. "Get in!" Peter didn't need to be told twice. The truck roared forward, tires kicking up dust as they tore away from the burning wreckage of the facility. Peter slumped back in the seat, breathing hard, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. Emily didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, She glanced at him. "Alex made it out," she said. "He's safe." Peter exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. Emily's hands gripped the wheel tighter. "And you? Are you okay?" Peter let out a breath, his gaze still locked on the burning facility in the distance. "I will be." Emily didn't push. She just nodded, focusing on the road ahead. For now, they were alive, but Peter knew this wasn't over, not even close. The people behind Steele weren't just going to let this go, and Peter, he wasn't done either. This was only the beginning. The safe house was quiet, hidden deep in the forest, far enough from roads or towns that no one could find them unless they knew exactly where to look. The kind of place where a man could disappear. Peter sat at the edge of the cabin's porch, staring at the tree line, his mind working through every detail of the last 48 hours. His body ached, his shoulder throbbed, and the exhaustion dug into his bones, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. Emily sat beside him, silent for a long time. She had barely left his side since they had escaped the facility. The firelight from inside the cabin flickered through the doorway, casting long shadows over the ground. "You're thinking too hard," she finally said. Peter let out a slow breath. "Not thinking hard enough." Emily tilted her head, watching him. "You did it. You got the files. You got us out. Alex is alive. The network's blind." Peter clenched his jaw. "For now." Emily exhaled, shaking her head. "You can't keep living like this. Like you're waiting for the next fight." Peter turned to her. "That's because there is a next fight." Emily's eyes darkened. "And then what? You destroy them, and then what happens? You think they're the only ones? You think the people who propped Steele up, the ones who kept this machine running, are just going to stop?" Peter didn't answer, because she was right. Emily's voice softened. "You're trying to win a war that never ends." "Peter." He stared at her, his chest tightening. "If I don't fight it, who will?" Emily shook her head. "You don't have to do it alone." Peter swallowed hard and looked back at the trees. They sat in silence for a long time. Then, a rustle in the distance. Peter's hand went to his sidearm immediately. Emily tensed, her fingers curling around the knife at her belt. Then Alex stepped into view. His jacket was torn, his face streaked with dried blood, but he was alive. He carried a satchel over his shoulder, a heavy one, and the moment he saw Peter, he let out a breath. "Well," Alex muttered, walking toward the cabin. "That was a hell of a couple days." Peter stood, exhaling through his nose. "Took you long enough." Alex smirked, tossing the satchel onto the porch. "Had to make sure we weren't being followed, and I picked up a few souvenirs." Peter unzipped the bag. Inside were files. Not just copies of what they had taken, but new documents, new intelligence. Alex had been busy. "This," Alex said, crossing his arms, "is everything they tried to hide. Names, locations, bank accounts. Steele wasn't the only rogue asset they were running. There are dozens of these operations." Peter stared down at the files, his hands tightening into fists. "Evelyn?" Peter asked. Alex's smirk faded. "She's still out there, and she's already making moves. The second she realized we were gone, she started cleaning house." Peter exhaled slowly. "Meaning?" "Meaning she's erasing everyone connected to this. She's not trying to rebuild. She's burning everything down before it can be traced." Peter's stomach twisted. "How many bodies?" Alex's expression darkened. "A lot." Emily crossed her arms. "So now what?" Peter picked up one of the files, scanning the names, the movements, the patterns. Then he closed it. "We take her down before she finishes cleaning up." The next 24 hours were spent preparing. They didn't have time to run. They didn't have time to hide. Evelyn was still ahead of them, and if they wanted to stop her, they needed to move now. Peter sat at the cabin's small wooden table, poring over the files, while Alex made calls to old contacts. Emily sat nearby, cleaning her rifle, silent but focused. Finally, Alex hung up the burner phone. "We got a lead." Peter looked up. "Where?" Alex rubbed his temple. "Evelyn has a meeting scheduled in 48 hours. Private airfield, middle of nowhere. She's not running. She's meeting someone." Peter frowned. "Who?" Alex shook his head. "That's the problem. No names, no traces. But the airfield? It's not just any airstrip. It's a government asset." Peter's jaw tightened. "Meaning she's still protected?" Alex nodded. "She's not just covering her tracks, Pete. She's cutting a new deal." Emily spoke for the first time. "Then we stop her before she can make it." Peter closed the file and leaned forward. "How do we get in?" Alex exhaled. That's the tricky part. Security's going to be tight, and we can't just shoot our way in, but I know someone. Peter narrowed his eyes. You trust them? Alex hesitated. Not really, but he's our best shot. Peter exhaled slowly. Then let's move. The contact's name was Darryl, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. His eyes were sharp but tired, his hands scarred from too many years in the business. He met them at a motel off the highway, his paranoia clear from the way he kept glancing at the windows. You got a death wish coming to me with this, Darryl muttered, lighting a cigarette. Peter sat across from him. You in or not? Darryl exhaled, the smoke curling around his face. You're trying to take down Evelyn Pierce, the woman who could have you erased with a single phone call. That's not a job. That's suicide. Peter didn't blink. So is running. Darryl studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I can get you in, one shot, but after that you're on your own. Peter nodded. That's all I need. Darryl crushed out his cigarette and stood. Then let's get to work. The airfield was exactly what Peter expected. Fenced in, guarded, controlled. But Darryl had access codes. They moved at night, slipping past patrols, keeping low to the ground. Darryl led them to an old service tunnel, forgotten by time. This gets you to the hangar, Darryl whispered. After that, you better be damn fast. Peter nodded, gripping his rifle. See you on the other side. They moved in. The tunnel was tight, the air thick with dust. Every step was calculated, every sound amplified. Then they reached the end. Peter cracked the door open, scanning the inside of the hangar. Evelyn was there, standing near the plane, speaking with a man in a suit, a man Peter didn't recognize. But he knew power when he saw it. This wasn't just a meeting. This was the real boss. Peter turned to Alex and Emily. This is it. Emily nodded, her grip tightening on her weapon. Let's finish it. Peter exhaled, steadying himself. One last fight. Then it would all be over. Or they wouldn't make it out at all. Peter crouched low against the cold metal wall of the hangar, his breathing steady despite the tension coiling through his muscles. Every nerve in his body was wired for the fight ahead, every instinct screaming at him to move now before it was too late. But he waited. Inside the hangar, Evelyn stood beneath the dim glow of the overhead lights, her posture relaxed, her hands clasped behind her back as she spoke with the man in the suit. Peter didn't recognize him, but he recognized the type. A man used to power, the kind who never had to pull a trigger because someone else did it for him. Alex shifted beside him, whispering, "That's the guy we want." Peter nodded slowly. "We take him. We take everything." Emily was behind them, checking her gear, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken much since they had left the motel, but Peter knew what was going through her mind. This wasn't just another mission. This was the end game. Peter exhaled slowly, keeping his voice low. "We move in fast. Take down the guards first. Alex, you cut off their exit. Emily, you cover the outside. We don't let her get away." Alex smirked slightly. "Finally, a plan I like." Peter gave him a look. "Stay sharp. They're expecting something." Alex's expression sobered. "Yeah. And they're about to get it." Peter tightened his grip on his rifle. "Let's go." They moved in silence, shadows slipping through the dimly lit space. The first guard barely had time to register their presence before Peter took him down with a swift, silenced shot to the chest. The second guard turned, reaching for his weapon. Emily put him down before he could pull the trigger. Alex moved fast, cutting off the hangar doors, locking them from the inside. Then Peter stepped forward, his gun raised, his voice cold. "Evelyn." She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. The man in the suit didn't move, but Peter saw the way his hand hovered near his coat, ready to reach for whatever weapon he had hidden. Peter didn't give him the chance. "Do it, and you're dead before you touch it." The man hesitated, then slowly raised his hands. Evelyn exhaled, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Well, Peter, I can't say I'm surprised." Peter kept his aim steady. "You should be." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "And now what? You kill us? Then what? You think this ends here?" Peter didn't blink. "No, but it's a start." Evelyn's smirk widened. "You still don't understand, do you?" Peter's jaw tightened. "Enlighten me." She took a slow step forward, her eyes sharp, predatory. "I didn't build this, Peter. I'm just a part of it. If you kill me, someone else takes my place. If you take him—" She nodded toward the man beside her. There's another waiting to step in. This is bigger than you, bigger than steel, bigger than all of us. Peter let her words settle, let them sink into the silence. Then he pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the man in the suit before he could blink, sending him sprawling onto the floor, his blood pooling around him. Evelyn flinched, but her smirk never faded. Interesting choice. Peter didn't lower his weapon. Not really. She exhaled through her nose. You just started a war. Peter shook his head. No, you started it. I'm just finishing it. A sudden crack echoed through the hangar, a sniper round. Peter dived for cover as the bullet shattered a nearby crate. Move! Alex shouted, firing toward the rafters. Emily was already in motion, taking down another guard who had been hiding near the entrance. Peter rolled behind cover, scanning the hangar for the shooter. He spotted the glint of a rifle scope just before the next shot rang out. He fired first. The sniper dropped. Evelyn used the distraction to move. She sprinted toward the far side of the hangar, heading for a secondary exit. Peter cursed, pushing himself up. "Emily, cut her off!" Emily was already moving, ducking between the crates, her rifle steady. Evelyn burst through the side door, disappearing into the night. Peter and Emily followed. The airfield stretched out before them, the wind kicking up dust against the tarmac. Evelyn was running toward a waiting black SUV, her escape already planned. Peter raised his rifle, then hesitated. No, not like this. He needed her alive. He pushed forward, his muscles burning, closing the distance between them. Evelyn reached the SUV, yanking the door open. Peter slammed into her before she could get inside. They hit the ground hard, rolling across the pavement. Evelyn fought like hell. She wasn't steel. She wasn't some overconfident soldier who relied on brute force. She was trained. Peter barely blocked the first strike, his ribs screaming as her knee drove into his side. He countered, twisting her wrist, forcing her hand back. She had a knife. She swung fast, the blade barely missing his throat. Peter knocked it from her grasp, pinning her down. She glared up at him, breathing hard. "You're making a mistake." Peter's voice was ice. "So did you." Then he slammed his fist into her jaw. Her body went limp. Emily caught up a second later, breathing hard. "Is she dead?" Peter exhaled. "No, but she's done." Alex pulled up in the stolen SUV, rolling down the window. "We need to go now. That gunfire's going to bring in more company." Peter lifted Evelyn's unconscious form, throwing her into the back seat. Then they drove. The safe house was quiet when they arrived, the tension thick in the air. Evelyn was tied to a chair in the center of the room, still unconscious. Peter leaned against the table, staring at her, his mind racing. Alex poured himself a drink. "So, what's the play?" Peter didn't answer immediately. Emily crossed her arms. "You said it yourself, Peter. This doesn't end with her." Peter nodded slowly. "No, but she's the key." Emily frowned. "How?" Peter exhaled. "She knows the system. She knows who's next in line, how deep this runs." Alex snorted. "Yeah, and you think she's just going to tell us?" Peter's gaze didn't waver. "She will." Emily studied him. "And if she doesn't?" Peter's jaw tightened. "Then I break every bone in her body until she does." Silence. Emily looked away. Alex sighed. "Damn, Pete." Peter finally looked at him. "You want out, Alex? Take the drive and go. Blow this thing open, but I need more than names. I need everything." Alex was quiet for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "Hell no. I'm not running. I just hope you know what you're doing." Peter stared at Evelyn. "I do." She stirred, her head lifting slightly. Her gaze found Peter, and despite the blood on her lip, the bruises forming, she smiled. "That all you got?" she whispered. Peter leaned forward. "We're just getting started. The war wasn't over. Not yet." Evelyn sat in the chair, her wrists bound tight behind her back, dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Despite everything, she smiled. A slow, knowing smirk that made Peter want to break her in half. "You've made quite a mess," she murmured. Peter ignored the bait, rolling his shoulder to ease the dull ache in his wound. He had fought exhaustion, blood loss, and the weight of a war he hadn't even realized he had stepped into until it was too late. But none of that mattered now. He needed answers. Evelyn shifted slightly, testing the bindings. "You really think this ends with me?" Peter tilted his head, watching her. "I think you're the only one left who can talk." She laughed softly. "You still don't get it, do you?" Peter exhaled. Then explain it to me. Evelyn's smirk remained, but her eyes flickered with something else. Amusement, annoyance, maybe both. You're looking for a name to blame. One person to put a bullet in, thinking that once they're gone, it all disappears. But this isn't a tree. Peter, you don't just cut off a branch and expect the rot to stop. Peter leaned in slightly. Then let's rip it out by the roots. Evelyn studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. You really think you can? You're not the first person to try. And you won't be the last. Peter's fingers curled into fists. Who's next in line? Evelyn chuckled. You think they'd let me know that? No, Peter. I was never the top of the chain. I was just a piece, like Steele, like Langley, like you. Peter's jaw tightened. Then who do you answer to? Evelyn exhaled, tilting her head as if considering. Would you believe me if I said no one? That this isn't about one organization or one man sitting in a dark room, pulling the strings? Peter didn't blink. No, she smirked again. Good, then you're smarter than you look. Alex shifted near the door, arms crossed. Cut the riddles. Give us something real. Evelyn turned her gaze to him, a gaze to something real. All right. She leaned forward as much as her restraints allowed. The people who ran Steele? The ones who made sure Langley could operate? They don't work out of some bunker, or a penthouse, or a secret military base. They work out of boardrooms. They wear suits, shake hands with politicians, donate to both sides of the aisle. They don't send kill squads, they send contracts. They don't threaten people, they buy them. Peter held her gaze. And they didn't buy you? Evelyn's smirk faltered for the first time. Everyone has a price, Peter. Steele's was power, Langley's was security. Mine was survival. Peter narrowed his eyes. Survival from what? Evelyn let out a slow breath. From the people who don't want names spoken aloud. Peter felt something cold settle in his chest. He wasn't afraid of bullets. He wasn't afraid of men like Steele or Langley. But this was worse, Alex sighed. So what? We take this to the press, leak the files, hope someone in Washington gives a damn. Evelyn laughed again, harder this time. You don't get it. You really don't. She leaned back in the chair, shaking her head. You think people don't already know? You think there aren't senators, military officials, even goddamn journalists who already understand exactly what's happening? Peter clenched his jaw. Then why hasn't anyone done anything? Evelyn's smile faded. Because the world wants this, Peter. It's cleaner this way. The people at the top, they don't like getting their hands dirty. That's why Steele existed. That's why I existed. That's why they built entire networks to do the things that keep everything running smoothly while they sip their wine and make speeches about democracy. Peter stared at her, his fingers twitching with the need to pull his gun, to end this now. Emily, silent until now, finally spoke. So why are you still alive? Evelyn looked at her, her smirk returning. Because I made myself valuable. Silence stretched. Peter exhaled. You give us something, a name, a location, something real. Or we walk out of this room and leave you for whoever's next in line. Evelyn's smile didn't fade, but something in her eyes flickered. Fear. She knew she was disposable. She knew if she wasn't useful, she was dead. Her lips parted. There's a meeting. In 4 days. Not in some hidden bunker, not in a dark alley. In broad daylight, in the middle of the city, because no one will think twice. Peter's eyes locked onto hers. Who's meeting? Evelyn exhaled. The ones who make policy, the ones who decide which governments live and which collapse. They're not field agents. They're not ex-military. They're businessmen. Peter felt his pulse slow, controlled, precise, deadly. Where? Evelyn tilted her head. What's the plan? Peter, walk in and start shooting? That's not how this works. Peter leaned in. Tell me where. Evelyn hesitated. Then finally she whispered. Federal Plaza. Tuesday morning. There's a restaurant, high-end, private meetings only. If you walk in there, you won't make it back out. Peter let out a slow breath. That's not your concern. Evelyn studied him. Then she smirked again, but this time it was different. It was almost impressed. She shook her head. You really think you're going to win this? Peter's voice was quiet. I think they've never met someone like me before. Evelyn exhaled, looking down for the first time. Maybe not. Peter turned to Alex. We move now. 4 days isn't long. Alex nodded. What about her? Peter stared at Evelyn. Then he turned, walking toward the door. Evelyn called after him. You let me live. You'll regret it. Peter stopped, hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn back. You're already dead, he said. I just haven't made it official yet. And then he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Emily let out a breath. "We're really doing this." Peter's expression was unreadable. "We've come too far to stop now." Alex rubbed his temple. "Walking into Federal Plaza with no backup, no exits, and going after men who control the world." Peter checked his gun. His movements smooth, practiced. "Sounds about right." Emily met his gaze. "If we do this, we don't get another shot." Peter tucked his weapon into his holster. "Then we don't miss. 4 days, then it would be over, one way or another." The city hummed around Peter as he walked through the crowded streets, the weight of his mission pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Federal Plaza loomed ahead, glass and steel reflecting the morning sun, polished, untouchable, just like the people inside. Emily and Alex were watching from a distance, ready to move if things went south. But Peter knew the truth. If this went south, there wouldn't be time to move. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, the small earpiece in place. Alex's voice came through, low and steady. "Last chance to back out." Peter didn't answer. He stepped through the revolving doors of the high-end restaurant, past the host, who barely spared him a glance. He wasn't dressed like a soldier today. No rifle, no combat vest, just another face in a sea of ghosts. He spotted them immediately. 3 men seated near the back, discussing the fate of nations over imported wine. They didn't look dangerous, but they were. Peter stopped a few feet away, adjusting his jacket again. The weight of the detonator in his pocket was cold against his fingertips. Evelyn's last words echoed in his mind. "You really think you're going to win this?" Peter exhaled. Winning was never the goal. One of the men glanced up, noticed him. Recognition flickered, and in that moment Peter smiled. Peter. Then he pressed the button. Outside, Alex cursed as the first explosion rocked the building. Emily whispered his name, but Peter was already gone. Just another ghost in the war no one wanted to admit was real.